The millionaire CEO was told he could never have children, until his ex showed up holding two identical baby girls with his eyes. Ethan Hayes had always believed in control, over his company, over his decisions, and over the trajectory of his carefully curated life. At 38, he had managed to build an empire that spanned continents, overseeing a multimillion-dollar tech corporation from a sleek corner office high above downtown Manhattan. His days were meticulously planned, his suits impeccably tailored, his composure legendary. But beneath the surface of success lay a quiet, private ache he had long buried, a vulnerability he refused to acknowledge even to himself. 3 years earlier, Ethan sat in a sterile doctor's office, facing a specialist whose quiet, professional tone still echoed in his ears whenever he allowed himself to think about it. The words had been calm but final. "Mr. Hayes, based on these tests, I'm sorry, but you're infertile. It's congenital and irreversible. There are alternatives, but biological fatherhood won't be possible." Ethan had listened silently, nodding at appropriate intervals, absorbing the information as one would a financial report, dispassionately, methodically. On the outside, he showed no reaction. On the inside, something quietly fractured, an invisible fault line opening deep within him. He left the clinic that day, closed that door behind him, and never allowed himself to reopen it. That diagnosis had come shortly after the painful breakup with Sophie Bennett. He had loved Sophie in a way he never thought he could, but their relationship had been complicated, intense, and ultimately destructive. She was everything he wasn't: warm, spontaneous, openly emotional. After an explosive fight driven by his unwillingness to let her fully into his guarded life, Ethan had abruptly ended things. He changed his phone number, immersed himself entirely in his work, and flew halfway around the world on a business trip, effectively disappearing from her life and from the possibility of reconciliation. He convinced himself it was for the best, ignoring the emptiness that followed and letting his professional success numb the edges of his personal loss. Now, years later, Ethan's world was structured around a carefully cultivated solitude. He worked relentlessly, traveled frequently, and avoided emotional entanglements. Colleagues admired his discipline, investors trusted his judgment, and his empire thrived, fueled by the control he so carefully maintained. But despite the power, wealth, and outward perfection of his life, Ethan felt strangely hollow. It was an emptiness he masked expertly, no one around him ever noticed. But on quiet nights alone, looking out from his penthouse at the glittering city lights, Ethan sometimes allowed himself a brief moment to wonder if something crucial had been lost along the way. One gray afternoon in November, while seated at a long conference table during a critical board meeting, his assistant quietly interrupted, whispering apologetically into his ear. "Mr. Hayes, there's a woman downstairs. She has children with her and insists on speaking with you immediately. Her name is Sophie Bennett." Hearing that name sent a sharp jolt through his chest, momentarily disrupting the perfect mask he wore. He quickly composed himself, his expression unreadable as he excused himself and headed toward the elevator. Stepping into the lobby, Ethan spotted Sophie instantly. She stood near the reception desk, holding two small toddlers dressed identically in pastel jackets. She was even more beautiful than he remembered, her blonde hair cascading gently around her shoulders, though her face carried a weariness he'd never seen before. But it was the children who seized his attention, the twin girls clinging to her arms, both with silky blonde hair and wide, curious blue eyes, looking eerily familiar. Sophie met his gaze without hesitation, her expression calm but serious, her voice firm despite the vulnerability behind it. "We need to talk, Ethan," she said quietly, shifting one of the girls slightly on her hip. "These are your daughters." The words hit him with the force of a physical blow, momentarily paralyzing him. Ethan stared at her, disbelief and denial fighting for dominance inside him. He remembered vividly the doctor's words from years earlier, the cold certainty of medical impossibility. Every rational part of him screamed that this couldn't be true. But there, right in front of him, were two undeniable little reflections of something he couldn't yet comprehend, challenging every carefully constructed reality he had built. And suddenly, for the first time in years, Ethan felt completely and utterly out of control. Ethan stood frozen for several long, tense moments, unable to speak or move as he stared into Sophie's determined yet gentle face. Around them, the lobby of his company buzzed quietly with passing employees, none aware of the seismic emotional shift occurring at the front desk. Eventually, Sophie adjusted one of the twins, Emma, Ethan would soon learn, to rest more comfortably on her hip, breaking the uncomfortable silence. "Can we talk somewhere private?" she asked softly, her voice calm but firm. Ethan nodded, motioning her toward a small private conference room just off the lobby, his legs feeling strangely numb as he followed her. Once inside, the silence was thick, broken only by the soft babbling of the twins, who were more interested in the unfamiliar surroundings than in the tense adults beside them. Ethan's voice was tight when he finally spoke, his words clipped with the sharp edge of shock and confusion. "Sophie, this doesn't make sense," he said, his eyes darting toward the toddlers who now looked at him curiously. "Doctors told me it's impossible. They said it clearly, years ago, biologically impossible." Sophie gently placed both girls on the floor, letting them hold onto her legs for balance as she reached into her purse and handed Ethan an envelope without a word. Her eyes were steady, unapologetic, holding a quiet sadness behind her determination. He took the envelope hesitantly, his hands trembling slightly despite his best efforts at self-control. When he opened it, his breath caught in his chest. It was a DNA test, professionally certified, and the results were brutally clear. He read the lines several times, the words slowly sinking in until he felt dizzy. Ethan Hayes, biological father, probability 99.9%. He stared at Sophie in disbelief, speechless and feeling suddenly vulnerable under her quiet scrutiny. Sophie finally spoke, her voice soft yet unwavering. "I didn't expect you to accept this easily, Ethan. But I didn't come here lightly. Believe me, I didn't want to disrupt your life again, but these are your daughters. I had no choice." She hesitated for a moment, glancing down at the toddlers who were playing quietly at her feet. "Lily and Emma," she added gently. Ethan felt a pang deep in his chest at hearing their names, at the idea that they had existed without him ever knowing. He sank slowly into a chair, running his hand through his dark brown hair, trying to process the enormity of what was happening. Sophie watched him quietly, sensing his internal struggle but remaining calm and patient. Finally, Ethan managed to look back up at her, his voice quieter, less certain. "Why now, Sophie? If they're mine, if this is real, why didn't you tell me sooner?" She took a deep breath, her eyes meeting his directly, carrying a raw honesty he had always admired. "I tried, Ethan. But you vanished after our breakup. You changed numbers, left the country, built walls around yourself that I couldn't climb over. At first, I convinced myself I could do it alone. And I did, for a year. But recently Emma got sick, nothing too serious, but enough to scare me. I realized they deserve more. They deserve their father. Not just financial support, though that matters, I won't pretend otherwise, but they deserve you. Your presence. Your love." Ethan looked down at Lily, who had begun to inch cautiously toward him, curiosity brightening her small face. His heart thudded painfully as he studied the gentle curls of blonde hair, the round cheeks, the innocent gaze so like Sophie's, and yet, he now saw, bearing subtle echoes of his own features. Slowly, he lowered himself onto one knee, allowing the child to approach him on her terms. Lily took another tentative step and placed a tiny hand on his knee, gazing up at him uncertainly, a silent question in her eyes. He felt an unfamiliar tightening in his throat, emotion swelling within him, overwhelming and raw. Ethan had faced powerful adversaries in business without blinking, had made ruthless decisions without hesitation, but nothing had prepared him for the vulnerability he felt now, confronted by a tiny, innocent human who looked at him as if she might already trust him. He swallowed hard and glanced up at Sophie, seeing quiet tears in her eyes that mirrored the turmoil he felt. "I don't know how to do this," he confessed softly, almost a whisper. "But if this is true, if they are mine, Sophie, then I want to try." For the first time since she arrived, Sophie's guarded expression softened slightly. She nodded, brushing a tear from her cheek, offering a small, tentative smile. That's all I ask, Ethan. Just try. And in that quiet moment, amid the complexity of shock, uncertainty, and hope, Ethan understood that his meticulously controlled life was about to unravel completely, and for the first time, he didn't fear losing control. Instead, he felt a fragile, hesitant sense of possibility he had never dared to imagine. The days following Sophie's unexpected revelation blurred into a surreal mixture of confusion, anxiety, and overwhelming emotion for Ethan. He found himself wandering through his daily routines mechanically, barely aware of the strategic decisions and meetings that usually commanded his full attention. Every moment alone was consumed by thoughts of the two little girls he hadn't even known existed, and the woman from his past who had now turned his carefully ordered world upside down. Sleep evaded him. Instead, he lay awake night after night staring at the ceiling, his mind flooded with unanswered questions and scenarios he couldn't fully comprehend. In an attempt to regain a sense of control, Ethan requested another independent DNA test, though he already felt in his gut it was unnecessary. When the second results arrived, confirming again that Lily and Emma were undeniably his daughters, the reality settled heavily into him, eroding any lingering doubts. Sophie had told the truth. This impossible, inexplicable miracle had happened, and there was no escaping the truth: he was a father. The next morning, feeling both anxious and determined, Ethan reached out to Sophie and arranged to visit her and the girls at their modest apartment just outside Manhattan. As he approached the worn brick building on a quiet street lined with small cafes and bookstores, he felt strangely out of place. Ethan had grown accustomed to polished marble lobbies, sleek glass offices, and penthouse views, places that shielded him from the rawness and intimacy of real life. Standing outside Sophie's door, his heart thudded nervously in his chest as he raised his hand to knock softly, unsure of what awaited him on the other side. Sophie opened the door, smiling hesitantly and inviting him in. Her home was warm and cozy, filled with photographs, drawings, toys scattered across the floor, and the faint scent of freshly brewed coffee. It was entirely different from his sterile, meticulously organized apartment, and yet he found a strange comfort in its gentle chaos. Sophie guided him into the living room, where Lily and Emma sat quietly playing on a soft rug, surrounded by stuffed animals. They turned simultaneously, looking up at Ethan with wide, curious eyes. Ethan felt a sharp pang in his chest, seeing their innocent faces stirred something deep within him, something he couldn't yet articulate. He slowly sat down near them, keeping a cautious distance. Sophie watched silently, allowing him the space to navigate this new and unfamiliar territory. For several moments, Ethan simply observed the girls, their delicate fingers, rosy cheeks, soft curls framing their angelic faces. Each detail seemed extraordinary, miraculous even. Eventually, Lily bravely toddled closer, holding out a small plush rabbit, as if offering him a gift. Ethan carefully reached out, his large hand dwarfing the toy, feeling an unexpected rush of warmth and protectiveness as he took it from her tiny grasp. "They're still getting used to new faces," Sophie explained gently, her voice breaking the quiet. Ethan nodded, feeling an awkward but genuine smile tugging at his lips as he watched Lily smile shyly back at him, retreating slightly to sit closer to her sister. Ethan glanced up at Sophie, searching for words. "You've done an amazing job," he finally said, his voice thick with uncharacteristic emotion. "I can't imagine how difficult it's been for you to do this alone." Sophie shrugged slightly, her expression thoughtful. "It hasn't been easy. But they're worth every struggle. Every sleepless night." She paused, looking directly into Ethan's eyes. "I don't regret anything." They spoke quietly for the next hour, awkwardness slowly giving way to genuine conversation. Ethan learned more about the girls' personalities, Lily's curiosity and bravery, Emma's gentle shyness and laughter. He heard about their milestones, first steps, first words, and felt the ache of regret at having missed these moments. Sophie didn't sugarcoat the reality of parenting alone, but she spoke without bitterness or resentment, simply sharing openly about the challenges and joys of motherhood. When the twins began to grow sleepy, Sophie lifted them carefully and placed them gently into their cribs in the adjoining room, leaving Ethan alone momentarily to absorb everything around him. Sitting quietly on the worn couch, he realized how empty his life had felt without this warmth, this connection, these tiny humans who had already begun to reshape his perspective entirely. Sophie returned a few minutes later, sitting beside him quietly, both of them suddenly unsure of how to bridge the unspoken gap of the past. Ethan turned toward her, sincerity raw in his voice. "I don't expect you to forgive how I handled things before," he said softly. "But I want you to know, whatever happens between us, I want to be here, for them, and for you." Sophie studied his face carefully, searching for sincerity, then finally smiled softly, nodding slowly. "I believe you," she whispered. "And I appreciate you saying it." As Ethan left her apartment later that day, stepping back onto the quiet street and breathing in the cool, fresh air, he knew deep within himself that there was no going back. The carefully controlled solitude he had embraced for years was no longer possible. He had 2 daughters who needed him, and though he still felt uncertain and unprepared, he realized that for the first time in his life, losing control felt strangely right. In the weeks following Ethan's initial visit to Sophie's apartment, he began to carve out regular moments to spend with Lily and Emma, attempting to build the trust and connection that initially felt so foreign to him. His previously predictable life was now filled with unexpected challenges and simple joys he had never imagined. Each encounter revealed new layers of complexity, diaper changes, feeding schedules, calming tantrums, tasks that demanded patience and tenderness rather than sharp intellect and control. He struggled at first, awkwardly holding a bottle as Emma squirmed restlessly in his arms, or nervously changing Lily's clothes after an accidental spill. But gradually, with Sophie's quiet encouragement and gentle laughter at his awkwardness, Ethan began to find his footing. Sophie was cautious but supportive, carefully allowing Ethan to step into his new role without overwhelming him. She was patient with his mistakes, softly guiding him when he seemed unsure or frustrated. Although their interactions were initially reserved and sometimes marked by tension, they began to settle into a rhythm. Ethan's frequent visits to the modest apartment became routine, something he found himself eagerly anticipating rather than merely enduring. Despite the lingering awkwardness, a tentative ease started to form between them, a fragile truce built on their mutual love for the girls. One chilly Saturday morning, Sophie invited Ethan to join them for an outing to a nearby park. Bundled warmly, the twins giggled happily in their stroller as Ethan walked alongside Sophie through leaf-covered pathways, the brisk autumn air brightening their cheeks. He found himself stealing glances at Sophie, noticing the softness of her expression as she watched their daughters play, the gentle way she brushed back stray locks of her golden hair, illuminated by the morning sunlight. Ethan felt a quiet pang of regret, understanding in that moment just how deeply he had hurt her in the past, and how much she had endured alone. As they reached a small playground area, Sophie lifted the girls from their stroller, placing them on the grass where they began toddling cautiously toward the swings and slides. Ethan hovered protectively nearby, an unfamiliar instinct to shield them from harm awakening inside him. Watching their innocent excitement at the world around them, he felt a sudden, profound ache of love and responsibility, emotions so powerful they nearly overwhelmed him. His previous life, driven solely by ambition and cold precision, now seemed hollow by comparison. Settling onto a wooden bench beside Sophie, Ethan found himself speaking without the guarded caution he usually employed. "I wish I'd known earlier," he confessed quietly, staring out at the girls as they explored the playground. "I wish I hadn't run away and built walls around myself. I missed so much." Sophie glanced at him, her gaze tender and understanding, yet tinged with sadness. "We both made mistakes, Ethan," she replied gently. "I could have tried harder to find you. But at the time, I believed you didn't want to be found." He shook his head slightly, his voice thick with sincerity. "That was never about you, Sophie. It was about my own fear, my own inadequacies. I never thought I could be the kind of person someone like you deserved. And after the diagnosis, I convinced myself it was easier to just disappear." He paused, taking a deep breath before continuing softly, "But now, being with Lily and Emma, seeing you again, it feels like I'm finally waking up from a long, empty sleep." Sophie remained quiet for a long moment, absorbing his words thoughtfully. Finally, she spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "You've already come further than I expected. I didn't think you'd embrace this at all, let alone show the kind of willingness you have. I'm grateful for that." Her eyes met his, sincere and open, and for the first time in years, Ethan felt a tentative but real connection forming again between them. It wasn't romantic, not yet, but it was genuine, honest, and deeply human. In the following days, their interactions grew gradually warmer. Ethan found himself looking forward not just to seeing his daughters, but also to the quiet moments spent with Sophie, preparing snacks together, exchanging stories of the girls' small milestones, laughing over their innocent mischief. He began to notice how Sophie's presence calmed him, grounding him in a way he had never experienced before. Slowly, the barriers between them softened, replaced by mutual respect and understanding forged by shared responsibilities and quiet support. One evening, as he prepared to leave after helping put the twins to bed, Sophie walked him to the door, lingering briefly in the dim hallway. Ethan turned to face her, hesitation in his eyes but resolve in his voice. "Sophie, whatever happens next, I want you to know that I'm not going anywhere this time. I'm here for them, for you." Sophie offered him a soft, genuine smile, nodding quietly as she whispered, "I know. I can see it." As Ethan walked away from her apartment that night, stepping out onto the cool, quiet street, he felt a weight he hadn't even realized he'd carried begin to lift. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe that perhaps the damage of the past wasn't permanent, and that his future, once so cold and controlled, might be reshaped into something richer, warmer, and profoundly meaningful. As the weeks passed, Ethan continued to immerse himself deeply in the unfamiliar world of fatherhood, gradually becoming more confident and comfortable in his new role. Balancing his high-stakes career with fatherhood proved challenging, yet he found himself increasingly drawn to the warmth and unpredictability of Sophie's home rather than the cold efficiency of his own penthouse or office. His daily routines shifted subtly, meetings were rescheduled to accommodate time with Lily and Emma, business trips shortened to return quickly, and his once relentless pace softened into something more human and manageable. But despite his growing attachment to his daughters, an invisible barrier remained between Ethan and Sophie, a cautious hesitation to cross back into the emotional vulnerability they'd once shared. Neither seemed willing to risk the tentative trust they'd rebuilt, carefully maintaining distance to protect themselves and their newfound equilibrium. Yet every shared glance, each quiet moment spent together when the twins slept peacefully, hinted at deeper feelings neither openly acknowledged. One rainy evening, Ethan received a call from Sophie, her voice unusually strained, clearly distressed. Emma had come down with a sudden high fever and was inconsolable, Sophie explained, her worry evident even through the phone. Without a second thought, Ethan left his office mid-meeting and hurried through traffic toward Sophie's apartment, arriving soaked from the pouring rain. Sophie met him at the door, visibly shaken, her hair disheveled, worry etched deeply into her tired features. Inside, Emma's faint cries echoed softly, triggering a rush of protective concern within Ethan. He immediately followed Sophie into the nursery, his heart clenching at the sight of Emma flushed and uncomfortable, tears streaking her tiny cheeks. Ethan gently lifted the small child into his arms, feeling helpless but determined to soothe her discomfort. As Sophie called their pediatrician, he rocked Emma carefully, murmuring reassuring words he'd never imagined speaking. Lily watched quietly from her crib, confused and worried by the unusual nighttime chaos. Eventually, Emma calmed slightly, comforted by Ethan's gentle presence, her small body nestled closely against his chest. After a tense call, Sophie returned to Ethan's side, her relief palpable at seeing Emma finally quiet. "The doctor said it's probably just a virus, but we need to watch her closely tonight," Sophie explained softly, exhaustion apparent in her voice. Ethan nodded, unwilling to relinquish Emma from his arms, feeling an overwhelming need to stay and help. "I'll stay tonight," he offered quietly but firmly. Sophie hesitated briefly before nodding gratefully, acknowledging silently how much she needed him at this moment. They settled into a quiet, long night together, taking turns comforting Emma, monitoring her temperature, soothing her back to sleep each time she stirred restlessly. In those quiet hours of darkness, their barriers gradually dissolved. Sitting together on the sofa, Ethan cradled Emma against his chest, gently brushing a soothing hand over her golden curls. Sophie, sitting close beside him, finally leaned her head wearily against his shoulder, closing her eyes for a brief moment. Ethan's heart skipped slightly at the soft intimacy of the gesture, sensing the shift between them. "I'm glad you're here," Sophie whispered, her voice barely audible but deeply sincere. "I didn't realize how much I needed someone to lean on." Ethan looked down at her, tenderness filling his chest as he murmured softly in return, "You don't have to do this alone anymore, Sophie. I promise I'm here, for all of you." They remained quietly intertwined like that, exhaustion eventually overtaking them both as dawn approached, the night's anxieties fading with the soft morning light. Emma's fever subsided slowly, her breathing steadied into peaceful sleep, and for the first time since his world had been shaken by the revelation of fatherhood, Ethan felt profoundly at peace. In the morning, as sunlight filtered gently into the quiet apartment, Sophie and Ethan awoke slowly, still close together, Emma asleep peacefully nearby. Neither moved away immediately, lingering quietly in the calm after the storm. Finally, Sophie lifted her head slowly, meeting Ethan's eyes directly, vulnerability and gratitude evident in her gaze. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice thick with emotion. Ethan reached out instinctively, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face, the tenderness of the gesture speaking volumes. "You don't have to thank me," he replied gently. "I'm exactly where I want to be." As Ethan eventually left to return home and prepare for his workday, stepping out onto the damp city streets, he felt deeply changed. The fragile trust built between them had deepened during the intensity of that long night, revealing truths they had been unwilling or unable to face until now. Ethan realized clearly, perhaps for the first time, that he not only loved his daughters fiercely but that his feelings for Sophie had never truly faded. He finally acknowledged to himself that he needed, more than a fragile friendship built around parenthood. He wanted them to become something real, something lasting and honest. Something worth risking everything for. In the days following Emma's feverish night, the dynamic between Ethan and Sophie subtly yet irrevocably shifted. Ethan found himself drawn even deeper into the lives of his daughters, spending more and more evenings at Sophie's apartment, assisting with bedtime routines, preparing meals, and even becoming adept at managing the chaos of bath time. The carefully maintained boundaries that had separated Ethan from the reality of domestic life dissolved further with every passing moment spent with Sophie and the twins. He began experiencing a quiet, profound happiness he had never imagined possible, an emotional warmth that filled the void his previous accomplishments had never managed to touch. At work, his employees and colleagues noticed changes in him. Ethan's previously rigid demeanor softened slightly, he became more patient, more empathetic. His stern reputation shifted subtly as he made decisions with a newfound compassion, understanding the weight and responsibility of caring deeply for someone else's well-being. Despite occasional curiosity from those around him, Ethan chose to keep his personal transformation private, guarding this delicate new balance fiercely. One evening, while Ethan was helping Sophie tidy up after dinner, the twins sleeping peacefully in their nursery, a comfortable silence fell between them. Ethan dried dishes carefully as Sophie rinsed and handed them to him, their movements harmonizing naturally, effortlessly. The domestic simplicity of the moment overwhelmed Ethan unexpectedly, stirring emotions that he could no longer ignore. Placing the last plate on the shelf, he paused, turning slowly to face Sophie. His heart pounded nervously, aware that the fragile peace they had established might fracture if he revealed his true feelings, yet also knowing that he could no longer remain silent. "Sophie," he began quietly, his voice trembling slightly with vulnerability, "these last few months have completely changed everything for me. The girls, being a father, spending time with you again, it's more than I ever thought my life could hold." Sophie met his gaze slowly, her brown eyes thoughtful, waiting patiently for him to continue. Ethan took a deep breath, gathering courage before continuing softly but firmly. I know I hurt you deeply before. I pushed you away, convinced myself it was better for both of us. But now, being here with you, seeing what I missed, I realize how wrong I was. I don't want us to just be co-parents, Sophie. I want more. I want us. Sophie stood silently, absorbing his words, her expression shifting from surprise to quiet contemplation. Ethan watched nervously, his heartbeat loud in his ears, afraid he had revealed too much. Finally, Sophie spoke softly, her voice gentle but tinged with hesitation. Ethan, I've felt something shift between us too. I see the way you've changed, how you've shown up for the girls and me. But I won't pretend I'm not scared. You left before, and the damage was real. I don't know if I can trust this again so easily. Ethan nodded understandingly, stepping slightly closer, his voice thick with sincerity. I don't expect immediate trust, Sophie. All I ask is the chance to prove that I'm not the same man who walked away. Let me show you, every day, through actions, not just words, that I'm here now. That I won't leave again. Sophie studied him closely, her gaze searching for sincerity, for reassurance that his words were backed by genuine commitment. Eventually, she reached out slowly, taking his hand gently in hers, her touch sending warmth rushing through him. I'm willing to try, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, filled with cautious hope. But please be patient with me. This isn't easy. Ethan squeezed her hand reassuringly, smiling warmly, relief and joy mingling deeply within him. I'll be patient. As long as it takes. In the following weeks, their relationship deepened gently, carefully navigating the uncertain territory between friendship and renewed romance. They began sharing more intimate conversations, opening up slowly about the wounds of the past, the fears that had once driven them apart, and the dreams they still harbored for their future. Each honest exchange brought them closer, their connection growing stronger, built this time on mutual understanding and respect. One afternoon, Ethan arranged a special day out for Sophie and the twins, a peaceful visit to a local orchard, their small family strolling quietly among rows of apple trees under golden sunlight. As the twins played nearby, Ethan gently took Sophie's hand again, holding it tenderly, feeling a deep sense of peace and belonging. Sophie smiled warmly, leaning into his side, allowing herself finally to believe in the possibility of happiness together again. As evening fell softly over the orchard, Ethan felt a quiet certainty solidify within him. He knew the journey ahead might not always be easy, that trust would continue to be earned slowly and carefully. But he also knew without question that the family they were building together, rooted in honesty, compassion, and second chances, was stronger and more meaningful than anything he had ever known. For the first time in years, Ethan allowed himself to hope, not cautiously or conditionally, but fully and openly, that the future they were now building together would be worth every moment of vulnerability and courage it demanded. Winter slowly melted into spring, and with it came a quiet but unmistakable shift in Ethan's world, a sense of wholeness he had never believed he could feel. The man who once lived alone in cold perfection was now part of something warmer, messier, and far more meaningful. The mornings began with soft footsteps and tiny voices waking him far too early, and the evenings ended with storybooks, sleepy giggles, and the comfort of Sophie falling asleep beside him, their daughters tucked safely in the next room. It was a life of small moments, not grand gestures. Yet in those ordinary rituals, Ethan found extraordinary peace. He continued running his company, still respected and sharp, but even his most ruthless colleagues began to notice a softness to him that hadn't existed before. He smiled more, listened more carefully, left the office a little earlier when he could. For the first time in years, he no longer viewed time as a currency to be spent solely on productivity. He valued what it meant to come home, to be greeted by two pairs of tiny arms wrapping around his legs, and to see Sophie standing in the kitchen, looking at him like he wasn't a millionaire or a CEO, but simply her person. As they approached the girl's second birthday, Ethan began planning something quiet but meaningful. Sophie had mentioned how she never expected to have a traditional family or even a stable partner again after everything they'd been through. She had made peace with doing things alone. But Ethan wanted her to feel not just supported, but chosen, wanted her to know, without doubt, that their new life together wasn't temporary or accidental. He had thought about proposals before, long ago, back when he lived behind a wall of fear. But this time, there was no fear. There was only certainty, and the gentle kind of love that asks for nothing but gives everything. He planned a small celebration in the park where they had once taken the twins on that cold autumn day. It was where they had first begun to reconnect as a family. Now, it would be where he asked her to stay forever. The sun was soft that afternoon, filtered through budding trees, the ground scattered with wildflowers and blankets. Their closest friends were there, as well as a few people from Sophie's side of the family and a handful of Ethan's most trusted colleagues who had become more like family than business connections. There were cupcakes smeared across toddler faces, balloons tangled in tree branches, and the gentle hum of laughter as Lily and Emma toddled between laps and toys. As the celebration quieted into golden hour calm, Ethan took Sophie's hand and led her a few steps away from the group. She followed easily, her expression curious but relaxed. The girls were nearby with friends, completely safe, and for once, they had a moment just for themselves. He turned to face her, took a breath, not out of nerves, but out of the weight of how much this moment meant, and reached into his pocket for the small, velvet box. Sophie's eyes widened, lips parting slightly, and for a second, time stood still between them. "I used to think I wasn't meant for this," Ethan said quietly, his voice steady and low. "Not for love. Not for family. And especially not for you. I pushed everything good away because I didn't know how to keep it. But you never gave up, not really. You came back when it mattered most, and you brought our daughters, and you gave me a second chance I didn't deserve. Now I wake up every day knowing exactly who I am, and it's not because of what I built or what I own. It's because of you, and them, and this life we created together." He opened the box slowly to reveal a simple, elegant ring, no grand diamonds or lavish flair, just a meaningful symbol of permanence. "Sophie Bennett," he continued, his voice softer, more vulnerable than it had ever been, "will you marry me and continue building this imperfect, beautiful life with me, for real, forever?" Sophie blinked rapidly, tears filling her eyes as a disbelieving smile broke across her face. She didn't speak at first, just nodded, covering her mouth with her hand as she tried to hold back emotion. Finally, she whispered, "Yes. Of course, yes. I never stopped loving you." He slipped the ring onto her finger with shaking hands, and she leaned into him, wrapping her arms tightly around his neck as if anchoring herself to this moment they had both spent so long trying to reach. From a distance, Lily and Emma clapped excitedly, having no idea what they were celebrating but thrilled by the joy radiating from everyone around them. Sophie crouched and scooped them both into her arms, and Ethan joined her, folding their little family into one close embrace. No one said anything for a while. They didn't need to. The quiet warmth in their circle said everything. Later that night, after the girls had fallen asleep in their car seats on the way home and Ethan carried them up gently to bed, he and Sophie stood in the doorway of their shared bedroom. She looked at him for a long moment, smiling with contentment that reached deeper than happiness. "I never thought my life would look like this," she said softly. Ethan took her hand and kissed it, resting his forehead against hers. "Me neither," he said. "But I can't imagine anything better." And in that peaceful silence, with the moonlight settling softly into the room, they understood what they had fought for, what they had found. Not a fairy tale. Not perfection. But something real, and hard-won, and full of promise. A life they had chosen, together. The months that followed their engagement unfolded with a quiet, steady grace, marked not by extravagance or sweeping displays, but by the rhythm of real life and the quiet strength of two people choosing each other every day. Ethan and Sophie didn't rush the wedding. They weren't trying to impress anyone or prove anything. Instead, they focused on deepening their bond and continuing to nurture the life they had built with Lily and Emma. The girls grew quickly, their personalities blooming with each passing week. Lily remained bold and curious, always leading her sister into new adventures, while Emma was more observant, gentle and quick to offer affection when someone needed it most. Ethan found himself memorizing the sound of their laughter, the small differences in how they said his name, the way their little hands gripped his when they were scared or tired. The love he felt for them only grew more overwhelming, more grounding, more permanent. Despite the occasional challenges that naturally came with parenting and merging their lives more fully, Ethan and Sophie had learned how to communicate honestly and gently. They made space for each other's fears, acknowledged the hurt they had once caused, and allowed themselves to grow beyond it. Sophie learned to trust that Ethan wasn't going to leave again, not physically, and not emotionally. And Ethan made sure to prove it, not through words alone, but through his presence. He showed up, always, without needing to be asked. The wedding was small, intimate, and exactly what they both wanted. It was held in the garden behind Sophie's sister's house, surrounded by soft white light strung through old trees and a handful of people who had become family. Sophie wore a simple ivory dress with lace detailing, her hair swept back with a few loose curls framing her face. Ethan wore a navy suit, no tie, his expression unreadable to most, but Sophie could see through it. She saw the emotion that tightened his throat, the way his hands trembled slightly as he held hers, the way his eyes softened the moment she stepped into view. Lily and Emma walked down the makeshift aisle ahead of Sophie, dressed in matching white dresses, scattering flower petals clumsily and smiling up at the familiar faces around them. It was chaotic, sweet, and utterly perfect. When they exchanged vows, neither tried to recite rehearsed poetry or perfect lines. Ethan simply said what had lived in his heart for months, that Sophie had changed his life in every way that mattered, that her strength and love had given him something success never could, that she and the girls were his greatest home. Sophie spoke with tears in her voice, sharing how she had never believed someone would come back and fight for her, not like this, and how Ethan had shown her that sometimes, the second time is when love becomes unbreakable. They kissed to the sound of their daughters clapping joyfully and their friends laughing through happy tears. It wasn't grand, but it was real. And for them, that meant everything. They moved into a house just outside the city, a quiet neighborhood with tree-lined streets and a backyard big enough for two little girls to run wild. It was not the life Ethan had once envisioned, but he quickly realized it was the life he had always needed. He still ran his company, still navigated the challenges of his professional world, but the frantic ambition that used to drive him had softened into purpose. He no longer sought to prove anything. He no longer feared being known. His world was no longer defined by what he could achieve, but by the people he came home to. Some nights, after the girls were asleep and the house was quiet, Ethan and Sophie would sit together in the kitchen, drinking tea and talking softly about the future, about schools, vacations, maybe even adding to their family someday. These conversations weren't urgent or pressured. They were full of ease and warmth and the kind of comfort that comes only after you've survived something together and emerged stronger for it. One night, Sophie rested her head on his shoulder and whispered, "I never thought I'd find peace again after everything." Ethan wrapped his arm around her and answered simply, "You gave it to me. You were the beginning of everything." And she was. In every quiet morning filled with laughter, in every evening spent picking up toys from the floor, in every shared glance across a crowded room when the girls did something hilarious or ridiculous or wonderful, Sophie remained the beginning of all of it. Ethan had found more than just redemption. He had found joy. And not the loud, fleeting kind, but the kind that stays. The kind you build, moment by moment, with the people you love. And that was the real miracle. In my opinion, the ending of this story is quietly powerful because it doesn't rely on dramatic twists or a perfect resolution, it thrives in the emotional honesty and the simple, earned joy of a second chance. Ethan's transformation isn't instant or effortless, it's gradual, shaped by vulnerability, accountability, and real love. Watching a man who once lived in emotional isolation step fully into fatherhood and partnership feels deeply rewarding, not just because he finds happiness, but because he grows enough to deserve it. Sophie's strength, grace, and willingness to forgive without forgetting make her an anchor, not just for Ethan, but for the life they build together. And the fact that their love isn't a fairy tale, but something rebuilt from pain, trust, and day-to-day effort, makes it all the more meaningful. This isn't just a happy ending, it's a beginning rooted in truth.